Anthony Javier was the epitome of success. A self-made billionaire in his early 30s who commanded the world of business with both precision and charm. He was a man who could afford anything he wanted: luxury cars, sprawling mansions, and a lifestyle that most could only dream of. But despite his material wealth, there was a void in his life that he couldn't quite place. It was during one of these lonely nights, after closing a particularly lucrative deal, that Anthony made a decision that would change his life forever. His secretary, Sophia Ramos, was a woman of intelligence and grace. She had been working for Anthony for nearly 2 years, and though their relationship was strictly professional, there was always an underlying tension between them. Sophia was stunningly beautiful, but it was her kindness, quick wit, and dedication to her work that had caught Anthony's eye. Over time, Sophia had fallen in love with Anthony, though she never revealed her feelings, knowing their worlds were too far apart. She came from a modest background, while Anthony was part of an elite society that would never accept someone like her. One evening, after working late on an important project, Anthony and Sophia found themselves alone in the office. The city lights glittered in the distance, and the atmosphere was unusually intimate. They shared a bottle of wine, and their conversation drifted from work to more personal matters. Anthony spoke of his struggles with loneliness, and Sophia listened intently, offering comfort without judgment. As the night grew darker, the barriers between them crumbled. A moment of weakness overtook them both, and in the heat of the moment, they found themselves giving in to the attraction that had simmered beneath the surface for so long. It was a one-night stand, driven by emotion and desire, but when the morning light filtered through the windows, reality hit both of them like a cold splash of water. Anthony was deeply conflicted. He prided himself on keeping his personal and professional lives separate, and this had been a breach of that boundary. Sophia, too, was filled with regret. She knew that Anthony's high society family would never approve of someone like her, and so she made the painful decision to leave her job without notice. She didn't want to be a burden to Anthony or complicate his already complex life. She quietly disappeared from his world, leaving behind nothing but a note on her desk, thanking him for the opportunity to work with him. Anthony was confused and hurt by her sudden departure, but his pride stopped him from reaching out. Little did he know, Sophia had left for reasons far deeper than he could imagine. Sophia's life took a sharp turn after that night. Weeks after leaving Anthony's company, she found out she was pregnant. Shocked and terrified, she considered her options. She was certain that Anthony had no idea about the pregnancy, and she knew better than to approach him with the news. His family's wealth and influence were overwhelming, and she didn't want to subject her child to their judgment. Sophia was a strong woman. Despite her fear, she decided to raise the child on her own. She found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city and took on various jobs to support herself during her pregnancy. Life was difficult, but Sophia's love for her unborn child gave her the strength to keep going. She prepared for the arrival of her baby with a quiet determination, knowing that she was doing what she thought was best for both of them. However, as her due date approached, Sophia began to struggle with health complications. Alone and without support, she was admitted to the hospital when labor began. The doctors did everything they could, but the delivery was difficult. In the final moments of her life, Sophia held her newborn son, Andrew, in her arms and whispered her love to him. She passed away shortly after, leaving her baby boy without a mother and no known father. After Sophia's passing, there was no family to claim Andrew. The hospital, following standard procedure, sent the baby to St. Mary's Orphanage, a small but well-run institution that cared for abandoned children. The headmistress, Mrs. Maria, was a kind-hearted woman who had dedicated her life to caring for orphans. She welcomed Andrew with open arms and gave him the love and care that his mother could no longer provide. From the very beginning, Andrew was a special child. He had a bright, inquisitive mind and a personality that charmed everyone around him. But more than anything, people were struck by how much he resembled a man they had seen in magazines and on TV, Anthony Javier. His dark hair, piercing eyes, and even his mannerisms were eerily similar to the billionaire, though no one in the orphanage knew the connection. Andrew grew up surrounded by love in the orphanage, but there was always a void in his heart. He longed for a family of his own, watching as other children were adopted into loving homes. But year after year, Andrew remained at the orphanage, never chosen by the couples who came to adopt. Still, Mrs. Maria made sure he never felt unloved, and Andrew thrived under her care, growing into a bright, well-mannered young boy. Every year, Anthony Javier made a large donation to St. Mary's Orphanage as part of his company's charitable efforts. Though it was a formality, Anthony took a personal interest in the orphanage, often visiting to check on the children. He was a man who, despite his wealth, believed in giving back to society. This year, however, his visit would change his life forever. As Anthony walked through the orphanage's main hall, Mrs. Maria gave him the usual tour, showing him the facilities and the progress they had made thanks to his donations. The children were playing in the courtyard when Anthony's eyes landed on a young boy who caught his attention immediately. The boy was running around, playing with a toy airplane, laughing with the other children. Anthony felt a strange sense of familiarity as he watched the boy. The child's dark hair, sharp eyes, and the way he carried himself. It was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood. Anthony's heart began to race as a wave of inexplicable emotion washed over him. Who was this child? Mrs. Maria, Anthony asked, his voice unusually shaky. Who is that boy? Mrs. Maria smiled warmly. That's Andrew. He's been with us since he was a baby. He's a bright boy, very polite and curious. We're lucky to have him here. Anthony couldn't take his eyes off Andrew. How old is he? He just turned 6 last month. Anthony's mind began to race. 6 years ago was when he had his brief encounter with Sophia. The timelines matched perfectly, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. After his initial shock, Anthony knew he had to learn more. He couldn't shake the feeling that this boy, Andrew, was more than just a look-alike. He pulled Mrs. Maria aside and pressed her for more information about Andrew's background. Mrs. Maria hesitated, unsure of whether she should reveal the details of Andrew's past. But seeing the intensity in Anthony's eyes, she decided to share what little she knew. Andrew's mother passed away during childbirth. She had no family that we could contact, so he was brought here. All we know is that she worked as a secretary before she passed. Anthony's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. He asked the question he had been dreading. Do you know her name? Mrs. Maria nodded. Her name was Sophia. Sophia Holmes. The ground seemed to shift beneath Anthony's feet as the truth finally hit him. This boy, Andrew, was his son, the child he never knew he had. His mind raced with guilt and sorrow. Sophia had died bringing their child into the world, and he had been oblivious to it all. Tears welled up in Anthony's eyes as he looked at Andrew, who was still playing innocently with his toy airplane. Without thinking, Anthony walked over to him, knelt down, and pulled him into a tight embrace. Andrew, surprised by the sudden affection, looked up at him with wide eyes. Are you my dad? Andrew asked softly, sensing the connection between them. Anthony's voice trembled with emotion. Yes, son, I'm your father, and I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in his life, Anthony felt a love deeper than anything he had ever known. He had found his son, and from that moment on, he knew he would do whatever it took to give Andrew the life he deserved. Anthony Javier sat in his luxury car outside St. Mary's Orphanage, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the last several hours in deep thought, trying to process the life-altering revelation that Andrew, the bright-eyed, inquisitive boy he had met, was his son. The weight of guilt settled heavily on him. He had unknowingly abandoned his own child for 6 years. But now that he knew, he would do everything in his power to make it right. He entered the orphanage the next morning, determined to take Andrew home and give him the life he deserved. Mrs. Maria welcomed him warmly, unaware of the emotional storm brewing within Anthony. After exchanging pleasantries, Anthony asked to speak privately with her. I'd like to adopt Andrew, Anthony said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. Mrs. Maria blinked in surprise. She had seen many parents express interest in adopting children over the years, but there was something different in Anthony's tone. It wasn't just interest, It was an urgency and need. "Of course, Mr. Javier, but adoption is a process," she began, her voice gentle. "We have paperwork, home visits, and legal matters to attend to." "I understand," Anthony replied, "but I want everything expedited. I need to take him home as soon as possible. I'll have my legal team handle it. I've already made arrangements for a DNA test." Mrs. Maria hesitated. "Mr. Javier, may I ask why this sudden decision? Andrew has been here for 6 years, and I've never seen you react this way to any of the children before." Anthony's face softened as he looked out the window, watching Andrew play with the other children. "Because Andrew is my son. I didn't know until yesterday, but now that I do, I need to bring him home." Mrs. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had always suspected there was something extraordinary about Andrew's resemblance to Anthony, but she had never imagined this. "Oh my," she whispered, eyes wide. "I had no idea. No wonder. I'll do whatever it takes, Mrs. Maria. I just want my son with me." The DNA test results arrived a few days later, confirming what Anthony already knew in his heart. Andrew was indeed his biological son. The moment Anthony saw the results, tears welled up in his eyes. He had tried to remain composed, but seeing the confirmation in black and white was overwhelming. He thought back to the night with Sophia, the woman who had carried his child and died without him ever knowing. The guilt gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't let it consume him. Now his priority was Andrew. Anthony returned to the orphanage that same day, clutching the results in his hands. He asked Mrs. Maria to bring Andrew to him. The boy, curious and a little nervous, approached Anthony with wide eyes. "Mr. Javier?" Andrew asked, clutching his toy airplane. Anthony knelt down to Andrew's eye level and took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you, Andrew. You see, I'm your father." Andrew's eyes widened, searching Anthony's face for any sign of doubt. "Really?" he whispered. Anthony nodded, his heart swelling with love. "Yes, son, I'm your father, and from now on, I'll always be here for you." Without hesitation, Andrew threw his small arms around Anthony's neck and hugged him tightly. Tears streamed down Anthony's face as he held his son for the first time, feeling a bond he had never experienced before. "Are you going to take me home?" Andrew asked, his voice muffled against Anthony's shoulder. "Yes," Anthony whispered. "I'm taking you home, son." The day Anthony brought Andrew home was one filled with mixed emotions. The drive back to the Javier mansion was quiet. Andrew's small face pressed against the car window, marveling at the world beyond the orphanage. Anthony stole glances at his son from time to time, still trying to wrap his head around the fact that he was now a father. The sprawling Javier estate, with its marble floors, grand staircases, and acres of lush gardens, was a stark contrast to the humble surroundings Andrew had known at the orphanage. As they pulled into the driveway, Andrew looked up in awe, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the mansion. "Is this where we're going to live?" Andrew asked, his voice tinged with both excitement and nervousness. Anthony smiled gently. "Yes, this is your home now. Everything you see is yours." They entered the house, and Andrew's awe only deepened. Despite the grandeur of the mansion, Anthony made sure that Andrew felt comfortable and at ease. He had prepared a room for Andrew, filled with toys, books, and everything a 6-year-old could possibly want. But more than anything, Anthony showered his son with love and attention, making sure Andrew knew he was truly home. For the first time in his life, Anthony felt fulfilled. He had spent years amassing wealth and power, but none of it had ever filled the emptiness he had felt inside. Now, with Andrew in his life, everything had changed. He finally had a purpose beyond business, a purpose rooted in love. As the weeks passed, Anthony and Andrew settled into a comfortable routine. Anthony made sure to spend as much time as possible with his son, taking him to parks, reading him bedtime stories, and simply being present in Andrew's life. The bond between them grew stronger each day, and Anthony found himself thinking less about work and more about his role as a father. One evening, after dinner, Andrew sat on Anthony's lap, his small hands playing with the buttons on his father's shirt. "Dad," Andrew began softly, "I've been thinking." "About what, son?" Anthony asked, stroking Andrew's hair. "I was thinking, I love living here with you, but..." Andrew hesitated, glancing up at Anthony with wide, hopeful eyes. "I want a mommy too. All my friends at school have mommies and I don't. Could we get a mommy?" Anthony's heart sank. He hadn't anticipated this conversation, though he knew it would come eventually. He looked into his son's innocent eyes and nodded. "Of course, Andrew. We'll find you a mommy." Andrew's face lit up with excitement, and he hugged Anthony tightly. "Thank you, Dad. I know just the person." Anthony chuckled softly. "Oh, do you now? And who might that be?" "My teacher, Miss Santiago. She's really nice, and she always helps me with my homework. I think she'd be a great mommy." Anthony smiled at his son's innocence, but was struck by the thought of Miss Santiago. She had always been kind and patient with Andrew, and Anthony had noticed her natural warmth. He hadn't considered her in that way before, but now that Andrew had planted the seed, he couldn't help but wonder. Anthony began visiting Andrew's school more frequently, dropping off and picking up his son so he could have a chance to interact with Miss Santiago. She was a gentle and caring woman in her late 20s, with a passion for teaching and a deep affection for her students. Anthony admired her dedication and quickly found himself drawn to her warmth and kindness. Each time he saw her, their conversations grew longer, from polite exchanges to meaningful discussions about life, work, and family. Miss Santiago was as humble and grounded as she was beautiful, and Anthony couldn't help but feel a growing attraction toward her. It was one particular afternoon when Anthony arrived to pick Andrew up that Andrew made his boldest move yet. As he stood between his father and Miss Santiago, he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Miss Santiago," Andrew said, "do you like my dad?" Both Anthony and Miss Santiago exchanged surprised looks, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Miss Santiago chuckled softly, her cheeks turning a faint shade of pink. "Well, Andrew, I think your dad is a very kind man." Andrew grinned widely. "That's good because I was hoping you could be my mommy." Anthony's heart skipped a beat, and he looked at Miss Santiago, who was now blushing furiously. She glanced at Anthony, unsure of how to respond, but there was a sparkle in her eyes. "Andrew, you're quite the matchmaker," Anthony said with a laugh, trying to ease the tension. Miss Santiago smiled warmly. "I suppose I am honored by your request, Andrew." As they laughed, something shifted between Anthony and Miss Santiago. The seed of romance had been planted, and over the next few weeks, their relationship blossomed. Anthony began courting her in earnest, bringing her flowers and inviting her to dinner. She quickly fell for his charm and sincerity, and they grew closer with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly lovely dinner, Anthony confessed his feelings for her. "I've fallen for you, Maria," he said, using her first name for the first time. "You've brought so much happiness to Andrew's life, and to mine. I want us to be a family." Maria, with tears in her eyes, smiled and nodded. "I feel the same way, Anthony." In that moment, their love story began in earnest, and soon after, Anthony proposed to Maria. They married in a beautiful ceremony, with Andrew standing proudly between them as they exchanged vows. Anthony had gone from being a lonely billionaire to a loving father and husband. He had found his purpose in life, not through wealth or power, but through the love of his son and the woman who had completed their family. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.